kung fu adventure story. Hook travels to the Orient, and there, in addition to his skill with a sword and bow and arrow, he becomes a kung fu champion. The story and all this stuff is in the Kung Fu Adventure set. Hook is sold separately. Confuse you say, lots of fun. The Fighting Furies Kung Fu Warrior Adventure set.
Matchbox toys are best known for their vast range of toy cars, a collection of detailed reproductions of just about every vehicle, real or cinematic, that you might think of in die-cast and miniature. Pretty much everyone has owned a Matchbox car at some point, I would imagine. The range also expanded into other vehicles, including sci-fi tie-ins to shows like Thunderbirds and UFO, and historical recreations of vintage vans, aircraft, and model kits that continue to this day. But the company has ventured into other toy territories from time to time, and the most notable of these was the ambitious and impressive Fighting Furies action figure series that had a brief but impressive run in the middle of the 1970s.
Esto sí que es verdadera aventura. El Capitán Hook y el Capitán Pegleg, los enfurecidos piratas Matchbox. Tienen un fantástico pulsador que mueve un brazo para pelear con el pirata más valiente. Mira, dentro de la pata de palo del Capitán Pegleg hay un mapa del tesoro. Y hay 6 cajas de juegos de aventuras con espléndidas vestiduras. El Capitán Hook y el Capitán Pegleg son malos y buenos a la vez. Son los enfurecidos piratas Matchbox.
The Fighting Furies were launched in 1974 and initially consisted of a pair of 8.5-inch pirate figures, more or less perfectly crafted to fit in with any young boy's burgeoning Mego collection. The series was designed by Marvin Glass and Associates and launched in the USA initially, and then made its way to the UK and European markets shortly afterwards, where they would prove to be much more popular. The initial 2 figures were Captain Pegleg and Captain Hook, a pair of amputees. Clearly piracy was a hazardous profession. According to the comic strip leaflet included in the box, they started out as rivals before becoming friends who team up to find hidden treasure. The narrative setup allowed kids to either have the pair fight each other or, as was more likely, to throw common sense to the wind and have them scrapping any of the Mego figures or similar sized dolls. It was not unusual for these 2 pirates to battle or team up with anyone from Marvel superheroes and Planet of the Apes characters to Cyborg, Muton and Evel Knievel. Unlike their Mego contemporaries, the Fighting Furies came with special functions, namely a spring action button on their side or back that would make their right arm jerk unsteadily in a vague approximation of sword fighting, or, rather more difficult to get right in practice, knife throwing. Both things that might well be frowned on these days but were seen as wholesome fun back in the 1970s. Pegleg also came with a treasure map hidden inside his wooden leg. A nice touch. Pegleg was a dark-skinned figure that suggested a Mediterranean character, and Hook was a ponytailed Asian with an impressive chest tattoo. That both these non-Caucasian characters were presented as heroic role models might be seen as a progressive move, but in truth, the action figures of the 1970s were about as diverse a bunch as you could expect, and none of this seemed especially remarkable at the time. Alongside the 2 figures, the Fighting Furies range also included a set of 6 costumes, allowing you to vary it up if you got bored of the rather exotic outfits that each figure came with. These were, by and large, interchangeable, though the Kung Fu Warrior adventure set seems to have been specifically aimed at Hook. Notably, none of the other costumes took the characters outside their established universe. They were all variations on sailing and pirate outfits, but they allowed kids to vary up the scenarios and keep the toys feeling fresh. New outfits have always been a good way to effectively give kids a new action figure without the full cost of a new doll, and keep them hooked into a specific toy line. With that in mind, the costumes, which often came with multiple small and fiddly add-ons like eye patches, tankards and such, were marketed as adventures. The Captain Blood Adventure, the Hooded Falcon Adventure, the Spanish Main Adventure, and so on. They came with comic strip scenarios, which gave you the background for each new character that you were effectively getting. This was arguably the most ambitious attempt at extending the appeal of an action figure outside the Action Man / G.I. Joe series. And for the more ambitious fan, there are also 2 playsets. Final fold-out cases that transformed into ships with assorted accessories. These always seemed less impressive, a flimsy affair that was too cramped for the figures to really do much in, and quite shoddily put together. There were plans for more substantial playsets, a longboat, a Skull Island hideout, and a shipwrecked pirate raft, but these sadly never made it past the planning stage as the market shifted towards smaller action figures. While the pirate range and its expansions were reasonably popular, the legend of the Fighting Furies is very much based around a third figure that was added in 1975. One who would quickly become everyone's favourite, and is, of course, the most sought after amongst collectors now. The ghost of Captain Kidd, or Captain Kidd depending on which bit of packaging you read, added a supernatural element to the Fighting Furies range, and remains, for me at least, one of the greatest action figures of all time. Maybe the greatest. The sheer effort that went into this figure was impressive. Kidd himself was a pale figure, green-skinned and dressed all in white rags, and perhaps didn't initially look all that fancy compared to his peacocking stablemates, though even at his most basic, Kidd seemed somehow a lot cooler. But when you turned out the lights, he transformed into a luminous, skeletal figure, one that was fantastically creepy. In the UK, Kidd came packaged in his very own coffin. The box resembling a wooden box and featuring a padded interior. Okay, it was printed on card, but still. Most kids would, of course, immediately demolish the box in their eagerness to access the figure within, but it was still, nevertheless, a nice touch. It goes without saying that finding one of these intact is difficult. The packaging also laid on the spookiness with a trowel, with Kidd swearing to take his unholy vengeance on those who damned him. No chances of this character joining forces with the other pirates, you might think. There was also the Captain Kidd's Treasure accessory set, a somewhat lackluster collection that looked suspiciously like leftovers from other sets, and didn't even acknowledge the ghostly nature of the figure. Oddly, Captain Kidd would barely see release in the USA, only being available as a Sears mail-order exclusive, minus his coffin. It was perhaps the first sign that the Fighting Furies were running out of steam. Perhaps aware of this and not knowing where else to go with the pirate theme, Matchbox attempted a 1976 revamp with a Wild West series. 3 new figures aimed at the cowboys and Indians market, and perhaps hoping to cash in on the popularity of the Lone Ranger action figure line of the time. Perhaps as a sign of what was to come, the new series was only available in Europe. In the US, the Fighting Furies had already fizzled out. The Wild West series is, of course, a much more problematic line by 21st century standards, and features Black McCoy, Kid Cortez, and Crazy Horse. A horse called Sundance for these figures to ride was planned, but ultimately abandoned. They did, however, have their own supplementary action packs, the cattle wrestler and war dance accessories that were impressively detailed. These were every bit as well put together as the Pirate series, even if the villainous Black McCoy and Mexican gunfighter Kid Cortez both looked suspiciously like retooled versions of Pegleg. They offered quick draw action for the cowboy and axe and knife throwing for the Indian. By the time that these hit the shelves though, kids were already moving away from the dubious pleasures of the Western. Adventure gaming was about to take a shift into the fantastical, and while these figures seemed widely available, I never owned one. In fact, I found them a bit annoying as they had effectively displaced the original collection. It also suggested a certain restrictiveness in the thinking for the collection. There was no reason why the adventures, couldn't have expanded beyond the seafaring world and into other territories as was the case with Action Man. While Captain Kidd was, perhaps, a bit restricted to the ghostly realm, both Hook and Pegleg could have easily become all manner of historical characters. The Western range was ultimately just as restrictive as the Pirate series. There was only so much expansion that could be done, and if kids bored of the existing scenarios, they were probably going to stop buying the collection. Action Man and G.I. Joe, much like Barbie, knew that the figure was effectively the starter pack, and the real profit came from a never-ending collection of expansions and accessories to freshen up the line. The Fighting Furies bit the dust in 1978, the final nail in the coffin being the runaway success of the Star Wars toys, which not only made Wild West and Pirate Adventures seem rather old hat, but reformatted the action figure to a smaller size. It is odd that Matchbox didn't at least try a sci-fi range of Fighting Furies. You'd think that the pirate characters could have easily adapted to space opera adventures, but perhaps the market was already flooded. And given the demise of the Cyborg, Muton, Android line around the same time, maybe the game was up for the non-Mego 8-inch figure. The remaining stocks of the Fighting Furies hung around in discount stores for a few years afterwards, being sold at bargain prices, sometimes stripped of packaging and sold alongside the cheap knockoffs. Like many a toy line, they were quickly forgotten as new generations of kids came along and the original fans grew up and moved on. Inevitably, I no longer own any of them. My own Pegleg met a gory end as part of a blood-soaked creative photo shoot, long lost sadly, that probably would have had the authorities alerted and my parents investigated these days, while my beloved Captain Kidd was amongst the assorted toys that I was persuaded to part with once I'd supposedly outgrown their pleasures. Thanks, Mum and Dad. Were you a Fighting Furies fan? Let us know in the comments. And remember to give this video a like, hit the alert bell and subscribe to make sure you don't miss any future videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.